I want to start out by making some key points and that I'm going to develop during this talk. First, there's really this extensive body on teaching and learning at the university level, which isn't widely known. And Richard Aram made a good point of this because he claiming there wasn't a research science of learning, and there is. The point is, I'm going to show you there's a quite extensive science of learning, and it provides rather compelling results that show that there really are teaching practices that consistently lead to better student outcomes, and we understand those really in terms of quite general principles going down to the level that Professor Duke talked about, and I won't have details, but in fact all the things he talked about are embedded in many of the most effective practices. And these really, for the first time, over the advances in this over the last few decades, really establish expertise in university teaching, what works and why, in a way that we now have can define expertise in medicine, other areas of science. And this makes it possible to really allow much more meaningful evaluations of the quality of teaching at both the institutional and the individual faculty level, which is really basically the extent of use of practices that research show us lead to better learning outcomes. And then finally, and I'll say a little bit about a different area that I worked on, but it's basically an experiment that led to large-scale change in teaching practices of faculty. So I want to start with the very basic ideas of, okay, how does learning at the university level really work? And the old model, and one that's frankly permeates still our universities, I think, is that these brains come into our classrooms, the students, they come into our classrooms at varying in different ways. We immerse them in knowledge, and it soaks in to different amounts depending on what those initial brains were like. Now, if you're thinking about learning this way, the primary focus of educational aspects of universities then becomes, naturally, a lot of worry about what goes into that knowledge soup that we're going to immerse them in, and finding out how to select and admit the best brains that are going to absorb the most. And then finally, of course, when things don't really work out as well as we'd like, blaming K-12 education system for the deficiencies. Now, the research-based view of this, in the sort of new way of looking at it, is these, and this was foreshadowed in Robert's talk this morning, is the brains come in not all that different into our classrooms, and as a result of the educational activities, these brains are really transformed in the process. Now, they don't actually get bigger, only in little tiny parts of them, but what they do get, is what I was talking about this morning, is they get substantially rewired. And that rewiring is in response to the thinking they do as part of their educational activities, and really the improved learning and capabilities they have is really embedded in that rewire, in the rewired brains that they have. And we also know that, or the research has established, that kind of rewiring is really much more sensitive to the teaching methods than it actually is to the knowledge stuff that they get immersed in. So, okay, so that's the very big picture. I'll get more details here. Most of these findings, and particularly at the level of the individual teaching and instruction, university levels, comes from discipline-based education research, which is something that some of you probably know about, but I'm sure not all of you do. This is really faculty in the disciplines, like physicists, biologists, et cetera, in the university, study the teaching and learning of undergraduate students in those sciences. And they do controlled experiments, comparing different ways of teaching, looking at learning outcomes in courses to find out what's better. And so that we have extensive data from this from these sources on the effectiveness of different teaching methods and new teaching methods that have been developed, tested as part of this kind of research. Now, just a little background. I think that this is mostly done in North America, although it's spreading throughout the world. I think the primary reason for that is just, as far as I can tell, the U.S. National Science Foundation has been the only place that actually put substantial funding into this over the past few decades. Also, it started in physics about 50 years ago. I've actually been involved in working in this field for about 30 myself, but it's now spread throughout the science and engineering disciplines, and it's edging into other fields now as well. There are major established conferences in these fields looking at the specialized learning in different disciplines and the education research on that. There's journals across these now, respected, established publication venues on this education research. I think it's particularly telling that you have examples like the physicists and the biologists, where the professional societies of these organizations have now come to see that research in learning is a reputable field of physics and biology, and so the societies are then establishing journals in this field in the same way they have specialized, research journals in other aspects. And even the most prestigious science publication, Science and PNAS, it publishes an occasional discipline-based education research. I'm pretty sure Nature and the European journals actually have never done that yet. So let me give you 3 quick examples of the kind of research so you can see what I'm talking about here. The first one is specifically looking at the amount of learning that takes place in the classroom. And so this was an experiment I was involved in. And so got 2 very carefully measured sections to be very identical by lots of measures here, of a big introductory physics class. And the control class was taught by someone who was very experienced at teaching this, had good student ratings, but used basically traditional lecture approach. The experimental class was taught by someone who was a fairly new PhD, but trained in these principles and methods of research-based teaching. And then the 2 instructors agreed to cover the same content in exactly the same amount of class time, and then followed by a surprise test given to the students right at the start of the next class. So there was time such that they weren't studying for other things, so it was just looking, okay, what learning do they take away from the classroom? Now, what happened in the experimental class design, I'll say a little bit more about, just because it gives you an example of what happens in many of these research-based teaching methods. Students had a short pre-class reading assignment, and then during class, rather than the instructor telling them a bunch of stuff, they give them problems to solve. For example, this light bulb and battery here, and closing the switch, asking what's going to happen to the brightness of that bulb. Now, since it's a big class, you want all the students involved. They all have personal response systems, so they push the button that votes for what choice they think it is. And after they voted, they're not told the answer, they're then told they have to discuss with their neighbors in the class, think about reasons and talk through the reasoning, and re-vote. And while they're doing that discussion and thinking about it, the instructor is circulating around, listening in on those conversations, getting little snapshots of what's going on in the students' brains. Okay? And then there's a discussion by the instructor following all this voting and discussion the students have had. And it, of course, is by an instructor who, through the conversations, through the clicker votes, knows profoundly more about the student thinking than in a normal class, and therefore can give much more targeted feedback and teaching to them. And the students' brains have been prepared to learn from this instruction. Okay, so I want to stress these are kind of 2 really essential features to all of the the practices that we see, the research shows, lead to substantially better learning. The students are actually having to actively think about something, and the instructors know much more about the student thinking and in their teaching. Okay, so that's the comparison. How do you think the two compare with the experienced, highly rated teacher or this? Well, here's the histogram of results. So this is the score on the test for the number of students this way. And in this particular test, without going into details, the amount of learning is really how far above 3 the students are. So there should be a couple of things obvious to you here. First, the amount of learning in the traditional lecture class is extremely small. Frankly, you could go repeat this on your campuses in any lecture class and you'll see very much the same thing. I've seen plenty of data even from my own classes showing that. But then, and more striking is there's far more learning in the active learning class, and it's really the entire distribution has moved up. So all the students are learning substantially more. We also measured engagement in this experiment. No surprise, the students are much more engaged. Okay, jumping ahead to another example. So most of the research in this discipline-based education research doesn't look at a particular class like that. It looks quite appropriately at the learning and completion happens over an entire course. And so this is an example of that, where this is looking at how well students can do after they've successfully completed the first year physics course at using the core concepts covered in this course, the concepts of force and motion. How well can they use those to apply in some simple new real world situation to make predictions as like a physicist would as to what would happen in that situation? So we've developed, physics educators have developed a good test in this, and here I picked this example because it involves a lot of instructors with a lot of different sections. They collected data over a number of years, and they basically were averaging on this 0.3 with a little scatter around that. Then they switched to this active learning or research-based instruction, and here's the results they obtained. Then basically all the learning from all the instructors for all the sections jumped way up, and now its average is about twice as much. So you have, and the key point I want to emphasize here, and that there's lots of other experiments demonstrate this, you can have the same people just adopting different teaching methods and the learning dramatically improves. Here, my last example is of a different field, different measure. This is from computer science at University of California, San Diego. The 4 instructors of the 4 kind of key, core introductory computer science courses all got together and basically changed how they were teaching to this active learning using very much the model that I gave in the first example of clicker questions and follow-up discussions, et cetera. And they measured the drop in failure rates here. And you can see it was a dramatic decrease in numbers failing. And so, again, you have the same 4 people simply adopting better research-based methods, and now they have about 1/3 the failure rate that they did before. So, okay, I could go on and on, actually, because a few years ago I started counting and got up to about 1,000 studies which compared this kind of research-based teaching with the traditional lecture approach, showing that the active learning is better. In fact, you can't really publish research on that anymore because it's so well established. People say, well, so what, But just to give you a little better sense of the overview of this, particularly across many fields, there's a meta-study that meta-analysis, Freeman and a bunch of co-authors published a few years ago, looking at a few hundred of these, looking at failure rates and different measures of learning. And most importantly, they looked across a whole range of sciences and engineering. And what they found was that there's really, within the uncertainties, really the same results, the same benefits across all of these different fields. Just to summarize these, looking at failure rates, they average about 50% lower. Looking at traditional exam scores, about a half a standard deviation higher. Looking at what I call concept tests, they're about almost 1 standard deviation. By concept tests, these are tests developed by education researchers specifically targeting how well students are learning to reason like experts within the respective discipline in the relevant kinds of problems. And basically, we see on those kind of tests for that kind of learning, which I'd argue is really the most important, the benefits of this active learning are larger. Now, they also showed that some examples are way above these kind of average results. Keep in mind, these are a whole bunch of different papers, people trying different things over different, over time. But in the cases where it looked like people were really implementing more larger scale, more complete active learning, the results could be much larger. And those examples that I chose, no surprise, were ones where I knew they were very extensive use of active learning and using it in the best ways we knew how, and that's why they're actually much, those examples I gave you are much bigger than these kind of effects. But I want to now jump to the fact that these seem to be consistent over these different fields and different levels, and explain why this is not surprising, because in fact, these are really based on these teaching methods, and what we find is most effective really are based very directly on, either intentionally or unintentionally, on the mechanisms of learning that cognitive psychologists have identified, and particularly the process of learning to think and make decisions more like an expert does. And those can be pretty much summarized in rather briefly. First, the brain has to be getting exercised in the right way to build the right connections in, and that right way means it's got to be working on challenging problems, but those problems have to really involve practicing the specific thinking skills, decision making that you want the person to learn, and they have to be getting feedback on how to improve their learning in a timely, specific way. And so you just build this in, you have a bunch of practice things they do. After a few thousand hours, they become highly expert. Pretty much a monotonic increase. And I think it's becoming more and more clear that this is just a biological limit now, that it takes that much time and effort to change those neuron connections to build in the expertise you want. But it also is pretty obvious if you think these are the essential components. That's, as you heard this morning, that's not what people do in a lecture, and so it's not going to be as effective. Okay, moving along, there's, it's still not widely accepted, but there's growing recognition of this kind of research. A few years ago, there were 2 sort of major national studies that came out summarizing this research and calling on institutions to pay attention and adopt this. I would say more importantly, just in this last year, the president of the AAU, that's the association of the 60 most prominent research universities in North America, she made a very strong call on that it was really irresponsible of the institutions not to know about and apply these teaching methods in their courses. And what was so striking about that is that's the first time this institution or any professional institution I know for higher education in the US has ever had anything to say about teaching. And so I think this is a real signal that things are starting to change. So you're now supposed to be convinced there's this wonderful body of research. We know a whole lot about what's effective and what isn't in teaching. I want to then move to talk about what are the implications of this for evaluating educational quality, where I'm going to just start with a summary. The things I'm particularly looking at are student learning and completion. A lot of the other things like joy and motivation are really built into these, but that's a different detail issue. So if you look at how well we're really evaluating these at present, or how well institutions are doing, at the instructor level, as far as I know, it's overwhelmingly dominated by student course or faculty evaluations. There's a bunch of studies on that. I won't take time to go into detail, but those largely reflect sort of how much the students like the instructor, and various things like if they're the right gender. But there's really, the data shows no connection between correlation between student evaluations and either the use of best teaching practices or the amount of learning obtained. And there's some good theoretical reasons to believe that you could never get that from student evaluations, actually. At the institutional level, we have things like THE uses of dollars per student, number of staff per student, et cetera. I would argue that those similarly don't really have any empirical or theoretical justification. Now, I have to say that for me, this was kind of a long time been kind of an abstract, general reality I was aware of, but it got a lot more personal when preparing for this talk. I went and looked at the THE's rankings of institutions by quality of teaching, and I was sort of struck that, okay, 3 out of the top 4 are institutions which I quite recently have been at as a consultant on teaching, actually. And I talk with lots of students, I talk with lots of faculty about their teaching, and so I know a lot about what their teaching is. In fact, the sad reality is I probably know more than anybody else at those institutions actually know, because it just isn't something they look at. And one of the things I can tell you immediately, looking at these top 2, is yes, they do have a lot of money per student. And what do they do with that? Well, what they mostly do, since they're focused on research, they go and use that money to hire a lot more staff who really are focused on, advancing the research mission of the university, and have very little, if anything, to do with the teaching. So the net result for both of them is to actually shift the priorities at the department level, at the institutional level, away from the importance of teaching. And in fact, if you look at, I'll make claims, and I know nobody knows any better, as well as me, that in fact, this leads those institutions to have quite a bit less attention to teaching and less faculty knowledge about effective teaching than what you would get at a normal third-tier university in the US. In fact, Caltech is arguably the most ignorant faculty about teaching that I've ever encountered, which I've encountered quite a few. Okay, so I'm claiming there's serious problems with this. So what's a better way? Well, I would argue the better way is really, the research tells us now, measure the teaching methods that are being used. And so if we look at what makes a good teaching, what makes a good teacher, the research is pretty clear. It's using using effective teaching methods. So whether people are using those methods or that method. And this also really establishes teaching as an expertise of, we know things that work, and somebody who understands and applies those principles effectively will get better student outcomes. Now, this is fully expert in teaching gets pretty involved, because I talk sort of about what has to go in here, but the research also shows there's a lot of other factors that need to be understood and taken into account in implementing the instruction to make this as effective as it could be, One of those is disciplinary expertise down here. This is, I'd argue, is really the only really solid connection between research and teaching, but in the interest of time, I won't go into that. I'll also point out that, when you start thinking about mastering these things and how you implement that in particular instruction, you got to realize that you don't learn this kind of thing in the typical 3-hour teaching workshop for the new faculty, okay? Okay, so I've already said, I think I'd argue that the individual level, we should be evaluating teaching. It would be much more meaningful to get a characterization of how an instructor does everything in terms of teaching a class, and then look at the extent of which they're using methods that research has shown lead to more learning. My group developed basically a way to do this in quite an efficient, practical way. You can go look at this and try it yourself. At the institutional level, we need to be, we should start evaluating the teaching quality of institutions by looking over all those courses and all those instructors and seeing on broad scale how much they're really using practices that we know lead to better outcomes. This is a proxy. You'd love to measure learning directly, but I'll just tell you, as somebody who does research on that, a lot of research on that, it's just not practical to do for all the courses and all the faculty like you'd like. But in the same way in medicine, you don't try and track every single patient. You want to look at a hospital, you look at what practices the doctors are actually using, whether they're washing hands. That's a good proxy for what you care about, and this is in that same spirit. Okay, so I'm going to just spend 1 minute, 2 minutes on a completely different subject of widespread change in teaching, and this was really an experiment that I ran over 6 years at UBC to see if you could change really how entire science departments at a large public research university taught, how they teach. And so this was a big project. I ended up writing a book on it that you can go read and get all the details, but I'll just touch on a few highlights here. One is, we showed that, yes, it is possible. It doesn't require enormously, changing the university, but we transform the teaching and the courses of most of the faculty in the Faculty of Science at UBC, so, 200 of them, as many courses, and the great majority of the credit hours provided by that faculty. And in the best departments, we had over 90% of both faculty and credit hours are now being taught in this completely different, more effective way. People talk about culture change. I think that's pretty clear that is a different culture there. Some basic factors that we saw help or hinder this adoption of these better methods. First one that clearly was a big help was we had these embedded science education specialists within the departments. So within a department, there was somebody who was an expert at both the subject and how to teach that subject, and so they could work with the faculty in transferring that expertise and how to apply it in particular courses they were teaching. One thing that's not widely recognized, but was and not widely expected, once faculty actually learn to teach this way, and I've seen this same thing now at Stanford where I'm working with people, the faculty much prefer to teach this way compared to lecture, and so they never want to go back. The things that hinder it, the overwhelming thing is the formal incentive system. This punishes faculty for learning to teach this way. And it does it because, it takes ballpark of somewhere in the range of 50 hours to actually learn to be reasonably competent, but that's 50 hours that you're not doing research. The evaluation system really only counts research. We have, as I argued before, there's no real meaningful evaluation of teaching quality, and particularly nothing that captures the fact you're using much better methods. And so the net effect is you get punished for, in the evaluation for spending that time. And so that's fundamental thing that needs to be changed. There's also issues about departmental organization that are nothing surprising there, but important. You can go read the book if you want details. So let me wrap up so there's plenty of time for discussion and questions. So just to go back to my initial points here, I think there's this extensive body of research. It is confined to primarily to the STEM disciplines, but that's just because people haven't been willing to do the kind of classroom studies where they have in other fields, they looked at much the same way. And because these are so linked to basic principles of learning, I think one can be very confident that when applied in other disciplines, you'll see very much the same results. And these really establish, what it means to be an expert teacher. It allows you to much clearer way to measure if somebody's an expert teacher and evaluate them and reward them for that. And so finally, I would argue basically from our experiences with the Science Education Initiative, that if you just start having meaningful measures of teaching quality and so people can see they have a real incentive to do this, it's going to lead to pretty rapid change. It's not that hard for people to learn to do this, and they're pretty happy when after they've done it. But I'll leave you with one final note here, was that when this starts happening, and something like Times Higher Education starts ranking institutions on that basis, it'll make real pressure and it'll be effective, but the most prominent places are going to really squawk, and that's because you're changing the rules, and they've been winning by one set of rules, and so Caltech and Stanford aren't going to look at 1 and 2, they're going to look at like number 300 and 313, probably in the other order, and so they're going to do a lot of arguing against this, but hopefully we can get by this. And so I think this really is a easy, in some ways, easy opportunity to profoundly improve university education. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Carl, for that fascinating presentation. And I think there was a great progression from some of the sessions we've had today. We had the sort of wake-up call from Richard Aram this morning, suggesting that what was needed more than anything was a science of learning, and then both Bob and now Carl suggesting that actually that research is out there if we just go and look for it and understand what's there. So really, really interesting. We do have some questions coming through on Slido, but I'd like to, as opposed to the earlier sessions when we had very little time, I would like to come to you as an audience and get you to ask your questions in person if I can. So if anybody has anything they'd like to ask.
Before I did do that, whoever changed the slides, can you go back to the previous slides? I wanted to leave those points in front of people to think about when they're asking questions.
Have those concluding points up on the screen. If anyone wants to put their hand up and ask a question, please do. While you're thinking, I'll just kick things off if I can. I mean, you presented some really compelling evidence there of active learning. You essentially said there's no point doing any more research in this. The concept is proven. This is absolutely the right thing for universities to be doing.
What I need to be more particular here. There's no point in lecturing anymore. It's clearly compelling that that's not effective.
Yeah.
The active learning we continue to do research on because it's the kind of tasks, the kind of feedback, what students have difficulty with in particular areas, and the kind of how to actively address it. Those are all places where we're seeing how we can. We do research to keep doing better and better active learning.
But I suppose the point I was going to come to was, if the evidence is that clear, even if it's not particularly well known, this must be getting out there. People do understand this. And then you talked about the potential hurdles that need to be leapt, and none of them seem particularly tall hurdles. So the lack of incentives, okay. The 50 hours that a staff member may need to be trained in, that's a week really, isn't it?
Right.
So I just wonder, especially as we would hope that there's this intrinsic motivation amongst faculty to be teaching students as well as they possibly can.
Yeah.
What do we, and you touched on this, you suggested that maybe THE could improve our rankings. I'm sure that's absolutely true, and hopefully you can come and talk to those responsible for the rankings at the session tomorrow about how we might do that. But is there not a way that actually we could just, really get over this hump quite quickly if leadership teams, is there just not the motivation for leadership teams even to take this seriously?
Right. I mean, I would say the experiment we did with University of Colorado and University of British Columbia, I mean, that's really what they demonstrated. I mean, I had a bunch of money, but it wasn't enormous, $10 million. So I could set up an artificial incentive program and I could set up support for people to learn that. But, $10 million compared to the budget for, for 10 science departments is pretty trivial.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think that's,
Okay, let's come here to, we've got two questions, but we'll take this one first and then come across, thank you.
Although there's no use in lecturing anymore, I still enjoyed your lecture a lot.
This wasn't a lecture, this was a sermon.
Okay. Coming from a Catholic university, this explanation. No, the point is, I think it's very important to look at student outcome, but not student outcome alone, because if you attract the best students, however you define it, you will have better outcomes. So getting better outcome in students who are not the best is probably more difficult and more important.
Yeah, so you're absolutely right, and what I didn't say, but is fundamental in any of these research studies, it's never acceptable to give the student, you have to look at the difference between the student input and the student outcomes, and that's critical to all of these things. So anything I was claiming something, we always look at both those, and this is talking about that differential value that you're providing, and I'm glad you gave me a chance to clarify that.
Great, thank you. Question here in the middle. You could just tell us who you are. And,
I'm John Robinson from the University of York, and if I may, I have two questions. You alluded to Anders Ericsson's work on expertise.
Yeah.
And I guess I'm intrigued particularly in how that work is extended to the arts and humanities, to all intellectual disciplines. You've given examples of it being extended to the sciences, and there is a lot of correlates, I think, with what Ericsson and others are doing. Do you know of examples of how this is being applied in the arts and humanities?
So by this, do you mean the study of expertise, or do you mean the teaching that's embodied in that? So there are, I know of several studies that have been looked at the nature of expertise in these disciplines, and if you look at the Cambridge Handbook of Expertise and Expert Performance, which is about 1,000 pages long, highly technical. There are several of those. History is one that I'm particularly aware of, and then I've talked with people in classics and about this, and you can really identify the decision-making process, how they make decisions when they're going through their research and solving problems. There's a whole series of, once you know how to examine this, pretty clear-cut things about they make decisions based on, they look for the nature of the sources, the background of who's writing them, the context in which they're written. I mean, all of these things are part of what they take into account, the standards of evidence, et cetera. So anyway, I'll say there are a few on expertise. I've been trying to get some instructors to, and I have a few possibilities of saying, look, let's have students practice making these kind of decisions. They learn a lot more, but there isn't any that I know of on that. There is in social sciences.
Thank you. May I ask
Ask us, absolutely, yeah, go ahead.
So the second question, you may have already answered actually in your initial response to the previous questioner, but you've said several things about lectures being obsolete. There's no need to lecture anymore. And while I fully accept the key points that you're making, there is a phenomenon now whereby we're seeing two-hour-long lectures on YouTube getting 1 million hits, more than 1 million hits, and these are quite difficult lectures. So is that not an example that there's something that's happening in lectures that still provides for something?
I give you no credit for hits whatsoever. Pornography gets lots and lots of hits. The latest celebrity scandal gets way more hits than any of those things. That has nothing to do with learning. You come back and show me how those hits correspond to actual learning, and most importantly, I mean, I'll just fall back on biology. You know, we know enough about how the brain works that if it's not involved in this kind of intense thinking about it, it just doesn't make the connections that you got to make. So, so I would A, not take that as evidence, B, be willing to bet you with very good odds that if you actually measured learning there, you would see it's very low.
Great, thank you. A hand over here.
Jim Conroy, University of Glasgow. I'd like to trouble several parts of this, but let me start with a trivial point. Clickers do not tell you what people are thinking.
No.
They tell you how they've responded, which is an entirely different process. And there's a real seduction about technology that makes people think that some of these technologies are actually giving you insights into thought, but they're not giving you at all.
So
that's only the first point.
Okay, so I'll answer that. So you're absolutely right, and I see faculty using them badly. It tells you more than you do by sitting looking out at faces, I'll say that. But you notice I didn't emphasize the faculty looking at clickers. The real useful part is listening in on those conversations, actually, and that being a much more meaningful.
And that takes me to the more salient point in defense of the lecture.
Yeah.
I mean, there is more horse manure talked about the end of the lecture than almost anything else in education. And there's a great deal of horse manure talked in education. And one of the reasons for this is, if you look at some of the research around hard learning and retention and recall months and years out, you find that the lecture is more durable and enduring than people imagine.
Look, I'm sorry, I just can't accept that.
Let me finish the point. I mean,
Well, your point's wrong, though. I know the research in this field very extensively.
You see, this is the problem. There's a great deal of research that runs counter to that. That's exactly the problem. And
You give me the reference, and then we can have a conversation.
The point is that in the lecture, we have persuaded ourselves that attention span is very short. And you get a lot of the discourse that says people's attention spans have been truncated and deracinated and desiccated. And the difficulty with that is we then form a set of social practices to match our expectations. And we reduce and reduce people's capacity for long, difficult argument. So that in Britain, 48% of the population think that 60% of the land mass is covered in housing. Now we let these people go.
Maybe we can go on to a real question. I'll let you cut this off.
Yeah, in the interest of time, I mean, the point is, are we dumbing down by leaving long form lectures? Is there any sense that we may be leaving because it's just too difficult for people?
I mean, you know, I just look at data.
Okay, let's come over here to a hand. Have we got a mic? So I can see an orange jumper, but I can't quite see who's wearing it. But yeah, there's a microphone coming to you. Thanks.
There's a wonderful invention of microphones embedded in foam balls that you can throw across the room. So,
Susie Jarvis from University College Dublin. I really enjoyed your talk, and I thought you made an interesting comment about challenging but doable problems.
yeah.
And I suppose my question is, at what stage do you think in somebody's education should they start tackling problems where we don't know the answer?
Boy, I'm not sure that's a tricky question, and you want it to be pretty advanced. You really want to have them be tackling things fairly early on where there's kind of decisions where there's no clear right, wrong answer, but there's reasoning involved. And I would say that's pretty early, but to get to the point in which there's really no answer, that's a tough issue to deal with, and I'm not sure is the answer.
Okay, we don't have huge amounts of time, but I do want to get to a couple more. Hand here, Arshad at the back. Yep, thank you.
Arshad Ahmed from McMaster University. Thank you so much, Carl. It was really interesting to see all of these citations that I think a lot of us are looking for. I was wondering about any kind of insights you might have about the transfer of learning. So we have a lot of tests, so we have a lot of outcomes that we tend to measure. There's a bit of a debate about surface and deep learning as well.
Yeah.
They seem to be heuristics more than anything that we can really put a finger on. And then the issue of transfer, it seems to be a dearth of literature there as well.
Yeah. So when I talk about these kind of concept tests of reasoning like experts, those are almost all involve some level of transfer. I wouldn't say it's far transfer, it's kind of near to intermediate transfer, because that's actually the most meaningful way to measure that. Issues of far transfer, I mean, there's a bunch of cognitive psychology work on that. Dan Schwartz has done the most impressive work. But, you know, I have to say, that's just a really hard thing to get, okay? And it clearly only accumulates over a long time of a lot of practice at doing that. And so, you know, I'd say these methods are clearly enhancing transfer, but back to my original point, we don't know how to do everything right. That's an area where there's still more research needed to get. It's just really hard for the human brain to do far transfer. You win Nobel Prizes when you do that.
We now have a clock flashing at us, so I'll just finish by asking one of the questions from Slido, because I think it is an interesting one. Is good lecturing better than bad active learning?
I would say that the research says no. I mean, you know, we have, like I say, I can give you 1,000 studies. Those have a variety of active learning lectures. What one can see is there are some cases, you know, a small fraction in which they are equivalent, you know, that there's no observed difference. There is no case that I know of in which there's a even reasonable active learning that actually underperforms the lectures. Now, it is possible that people don't want to try and publish it because they think, oh, people believe you don't know what you're doing, which is probably the case. But no, there's really, you know, when looking at this, there's really no reputable study which has shown the learning to be superior.
Well, that's fascinating. Really, really strong advocacy for a style of learning that it sounds like you know has perhaps gone under the radar a little bit for many institutions. So, thank you so much, Carl, for that talk. Please do join me in thanking Carl for that fascinating conversation. Thank you. It's great. Really interesting.